Okay, we're moving along. Hopefully, this will be the last year on Siman Ayin Bays, and we're up to Sif Yud Zayin. So the Kitzur says like this: Hatavshilin tzrichin lashgiach lasira min hagecholim koydem Shabbos. The way they used to bake bread, they used to bake foods. They would put the pot inside of a pile of coals or something like that, and that's how it would heat up. So if someone puts them in and it's cooking before Shabbos, the problem is that the coals don't go out right away. The coals are still on when Shabbos starts. So if that's the case, you have to make sure to remove them when before Shabbos starts. Okay, now why is that? We'll see. Why is that? Let's say a person forgot by mistake, and they did not take it off. Azai, so then it's a problem. In Yovi b'Shabbos l'kachas asakdeira, if someone comes to take the pot, let's say it's a pot of soup. They want to take the pot of soup and it's sitting in a pile of coals on Shabbos. So the and these coals are still, the embers are still burning surrounding this pot. And the way that it's placed is, if you're going to take the pot, what's going to end up happening is you're going to move all of those coals, right? The coals are basically going to move. So if that's the case, and what happens when the coals move? Then the flame gets bigger. That's a problem of basically mavir on Shabbos, of making a fire. So therefore, Asr Yisrael Lakachas Oisa. A Yid is not allowed to take it. If you take that pot, you're going to make the flame bigger. However, if you do it through a guy, so then mutter you could, because you're telling him to take the pot. You're not telling him to stoke the flame. And lav dafke, will the flame even get bigger in the first place? If it does, then it might be an issue, but it's not going to be quite the same. Now, the Alter Rebbe, when he writes this halacha, he does make a difference between how it's set up around the coals. In other words, sometimes you could place it on top of the coals, and sometimes you could push it into the coals. If you push it into the coals, then it's a problem, because as soon as you pick it up, it will collapse the walls around it and make the flame bigger. But if it's placed gently on top of the coals, so then you're not going to have that problem, and then you'd be able to do it. Okay, we'll leave that. It gets a little more complicated, but we'll leave it for now. Okay, Sif Yud Ches. Okay. So Sif Yud Ches goes like this. Tafshilin shematminim betanur liyom Shabbos. So now we're getting to the things that we started to discuss at length outside, which is the idea of leaving things from before Shabbos, which is what we call shehiyah. That was the whole thing we spent the last couple of days on. So here the halacha is like this. Tafshilin shematminim betanur liyom Shabbos. Let's say you want to leave food in an oven for later, right? So you left it in from before Shabbos, and you want to be able to use it later. So the Allah, and this he adds and he says kanohog, meaning this is the normal thing that people did. They used to leave things in a pot. We'll see soon, either seal it or not, but they would leave it in a pot, in an oven. Leave it till the next day. Now, afal pi shapesach einoi tuach petit. Even though you left it in an oven where you did not seal it, remember one of the Hatayr we mentioned about doing this idea of shehiyah is if you lock it or seal it or take off the knobs. So here it was not sealed. The halacha is it's still possible for it to be mutter. Okay, we'll see, right? We'll see soon why. It's going to continue in the next sif and explain. It's still possible that you're allowed to do this. You're allowed to leave food inside of an oven that's not sealed, meaning it doesn't have a blech. You could still leave it there. However, you can't open it that night. Why not? Not for what we were describing, that you might stoke the flames or whatever. That's something else. The reason that he says is because in those days it was an oven. It was inside of an oven. You break it open, and then what are you going to do? He explains, let's say you have other pots, and these other pots are not fully cooked yet. When you close the oven again, yigra and bishul, you're going to cause cooking. So just to take this, let's say on those pots. So taking this to our modern kitchen, again, our ovens are much more complicated because every time you open it, you could be impacting the thermostat and turning on the fire. So it's a lot more complicated. But assuming you didn't have any other issue, but the fact is, if you have, let's say, 2-3 pans and some of them are still cooking, when you close the door, now it's going to continue cooking. So that's going to be a problem that you're causing it to continue cooking. So that would be issue number one. Issue number one is that even if technically you're allowed to leave something in, which as we'll see what he means soon, let's assume you still have other issues that if you open the door to take something out, now what happens? Can you close the door? Either in our ovens, you're going to cause the fire to go on, or in their ovens, you'll continue to cook other foods that might still be in there, and for us as well. So you have a lot of issues with doing that if the oven is on. Then he says like this, number is Sif Yud Tes. And this we should be familiar with. When we say that you're allowed to leave something in an oven already from before Shabbos, even though the oven is not locked or sealed, which means that it doesn't have a blech, basically. So zeu dafke, this is only in a case when you're putting putting in this pot. And they add from the Alter Rebbe, it's a tavshil sheyesh afilu rak chaticha acha shel basar. It has to be a few types of cases. Number one, you're putting in a pot that has even one piece of meat, of basar, v'dafka, and then he adds from what the Alter Rebbe says, v'dafka k'shematminin samuch l'chasheich l'mamish, and you're putting it in right before Shabbos. So case number one, where you could put something in right before Shabbos, is if you're putting in a raw piece of meat, as we mentioned, because then we're not afraid that you're going to stoke it and try to make it go quicker because it's going to take too long. Which again, we said nowadays might not be a good heter, but in those days it was. Like what happens if you're not putting in a raw piece of meat? Let's say you're putting in other stuff, either breads or vegetables or things like that. But you're not putting it in right before Shabbos. You're putting it in Friday afternoon, and therefore it's going to be able to be cooked a little bit before Shabbos starts, to the point that you could eat it at Yidei Atchak, which is what we called Michael Ben Drusai, either a third or a half. So then also you could. So now we have two options. When can you put something into this oven that does not have a blech? That would be if number one, you're putting in something raw right before Shabbos, or if number two, you're putting in something that was already cooked to the point that it's edible in some way. Aval. However, if you don't have those conditions, let's say you're putting in different vegetables or basically not meat that's raw, and you're putting it in right before Shabbos. The halacha is you need to seal your oven. Like we mentioned, one of the ideas was to lock it or something like that, because then by the time you open it, you'll already remember that it's Shabbos. That's what the Alter Rebbe describes it. And why do you have to lock it? You have other options. So he says, "Kimina stam in a garo for katan kuro," because most likely you didn't put a proper blech on. So he throws that in. But the point is, he's adding another heter. You could have a blech, number one, or you could lock or seal this thing, which we described might mean taping the buttons or things like that, or taking them off. What we have to be very careful with this. And this is what we just ended off with today. That if you don't do this, that means if you violate this, you put in a food that's not meat, and it's raw, and it starts to cook too little, and it's not ready, and you didn't lock the oven, and you don't have a blech, even after the fact, you are not allowed to eat these foods till after Shabbos, and then you have to wait the amount of time it would take to make the food after Shabbos, because you did it on purpose. If you did it by mistake, then you could just have it after Shabbos. But if you did it on purpose, which is this case, you did it dafka, then you'd have to wait till after Shabbos, the amount of time it takes. So this is a very condensed version of what we spoke about outside, but now it makes a lot of sense, I hope, right? Okay, Chaf. Sif Chaf. B'Shabbos k'shapeschen esatanor shehu tuach petit. Let's say it's Shabbos, and again, in those days, they would plaster like mud, type of thing around the oven to seal it, to give it insulation. So if you want to open that oven on Shabbos, the only way to do that is through a guy. You have to ask someone else to do it for you, because you're not allowed to break something. It's called seiser. We'll talk about it later if it applies really to kalim or not. So it may or may not be, but ideally you should have a guy do it because we are concerned for it. But if there is no one that's not Jewish that can do it for you, so so then ideally you should ask a child to do it. They don't realize what's happening, so then it's okay. The email katan, but if there's no child around, then mutter gam legadol lepascha. So you yourself could open it if you need to, right? However, you should try to do it in a roundabout, in an odd way, in an abnormal way. When he comes back, left hand. I've heard that lav dafka would a left hand work instead of a right hand. It would mean probably using your right hand, but in a different way. I know, but I know. So I always thought that if righties could do left and lefts could do righties, but I recently came across something where it said that it's lav dafka. Would that count as enough of a shinoi? You have to do it in a different way. Meaning, let's say you normally, let's just say, for example, you normally push something like this, like always. This is the way you do it. You kind of go like that, so you'd have to go like this. You have to do something that shows you in a different way. Left hand, I think they say wouldn't do that enough. Even though it won't do as good of a job as the right hand, but still, it sounds like that it wouldn't be considered a shinoi. Yeah.
But like the way that pick it up, it's not like pick it up like this. Let's say you need to like flip something that people can touch on.
Yeah, something that would be different enough that it would let everyone know. Yeah.
Then you can ask the guy saying like you ask like Shabbos or like you could just ask the guy regularly.
Good question. Very good question. In this case, you can ask straight. Because by Poil, if the guy can't do it, you can do it yourself. So it's not a real issue. We just don't want to. We'll talk about it later. We'll get to the whole Amir al thing later. There are times that you can ask a guy directly to do things for you.
When I say the Kitzur that you should ask the guy immediately.
Yeah. When what we call like hinting and whatever, I mean all that shtick as they say, that's not called asking a guy. Right? You're not allowed to ask in those cases. So you're doing a roundabout hint in order to get him to understand what you want, and somehow it may or may not work, as we'll see when we get there. But here, if you can't find someone, then a kid could do it. If a kid can't do it, then you could do it. So obviously it can't be such a big issue. And it's not, because like I mentioned, soiser, to break is lavdaka applies to kalim. It really applies to structures. So we don't like to break things on Shabbos. We'll talk about, for example, opening bottles, cans, things like that. But Poil, there are cases that you could. Okay, let's move along. Sif Chafal, I just want to finish this. We'll do this part quickly, but okay. Hamatmin, anyone know what this word is? The second word of Chafalef? Hamatmin.
Coffee.
Coffee. Depends how you pronounce it.
Coffee.
Right, cafe or coffee if you're from Brooklyn, or coffee if you're from somewhere fancy. Okay. Hamatmin Kafeh be'erev Shabbos. Someone takes their coffee before Shabbos. Now, and what they would do is, without getting into details, the bishul part in different cases is a challenge. Let's just put it that way. Now, there's different ways around it and how we do it, so we'll talk about that much later. But just for now, for the purposes of now, the guy prepared a brew before Shabbos, which people do even till today. They'll make like tea essence. No, I'm talking specifically about hot. They would make basically already cooked tea, boiling, and put it on top of like a place where it keeps it warm. And then on Shabbos, they would take a concentrate. They would take a little bit and they would just add regular other hot water. So whatever. The point is that you took this pot of coffee before Shabbos that was made, and you wanted to stay warm. So what would you do? You would put it b'toich aguma. You would dig a little hole, an insulated hole, like back in the day, and you would put it, let's say, Shabbos, leave it there so that later you could have it. Now, how do you keep it safe and warm? So you would cover it with like pillows or a sheet, whatever, things that can keep it insulated. And why would you do that? It should stay warm. So if you're putting it inside of sand, right? Choil is sand. Asur lahatmin kol hakli b'toich hachoil. This is called, so let's just say this quickly outside. There are two different types of insulation that you can do. One of them is called hatmana b'davar ha'meisif hevel, and one of them is called hatmana b'davar she'eino meisif hevel. Meisif hevel means increases heat. Anything that increases heat, you're not allowed to do hatmana even before Shabbos. That means if you want to put your, let's just say in this case, it was a pot of coffee in the ground, in sand, that sand is considered something that's meisif hevel, that increases heat for whatever reason. It's a scientific, but we're not going to get into it now. The point is then you're not allowed to do atmana, even in Shabbos. So what could you do? You could put it in halfway, because halfway is not atmana. Atmana means completely sealed with the seal touching it. Okay, 1 second. So therefore, in this case, if you want to put your pot of coffee in the sand, and the sand is a davar shel hevel, you're not allowed to put it in completely inside the sand. And even if you're going to only put half of the pot into the sand, and the other half you're going to do you're going to cover with other stuff, in a way that in the end of the day, the entire keli is covered, just not completely with sand. Half sand and half something else, a beged. Gamza aser, it's also aser. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a hot water china, because they call it pot, an urn, whatever. And on top of it, you take this insulated fitted, cover, and you slip it on to the hot water machine. That could be a problem. Why? Because the insulated thing that you're putting on only goes at a certain point, but the bottom part of it is hot. So it's hot, and you're covering it with a davar, with a regular sheet, which usually, or whatever, cushion, whatever it is, which usually is not a problem, but because the bottom is a source of heat, it becomes a problem. So my parents, for example, when we grew up, they used to have this little pot that they would put on the fire. Back in the day before electricity was around. No, I'm kidding. They had electricity, but they would basically leave it on the fire. They liked it very hot. And then they got this cover that would you pull down onto the hot water china. So that was a possibility. But the only way that would work is if it doesn't completely cover it. You'd have to leave part of the pot uncovered. You cannot seal it completely. If it's completely covered and the only part that's open is where the fire is, that's called atmana, and it's asur on Shabbos. Okay, let's leave that. We'll move along. You'll ask me any questions later. I just want to be able to finish. So what should you do? What should you do? The way to do it would be like this. The pot, let's just call it, that has the coffee in it. You should only put it in halfway, or maybe only a third, in the sand. And the rest of it, should be exposed outside. And then on top of the hole, in where this pot, let's say, is, or so you on top of the pot or on top of the hole, you put a daf, you put a board, or yichbal of kli, or you put another keli upside down. That there should be a space between the keli and the coffee. So in other words, you don't want, when you say insulation means completely hugging it from all sides. That's the problem. But if it's not hugging it from all sides, then it would be okay. On that part that you put, let's just say a board. So in other words, let's say like this. This is my microphone, yeah? So if I cover it with a slip-on that goes exactly on, that's atmana. But if I put this on top, and then I throw over the blanket this way, so it's still containing it, but this area is empty till it hits the what do you call it, the sheet or the blanket. So that's not called atmana. That's called you're trying to save the heat. There's an ear space, and therefore it's not atmana. So then it would be mutter. And this, he says, you could see other places. We're not going to get into it now. Okay, let's do Chabez and Gimel quickly. Chabez, Samuch l'chashecha. When it gets closer to Shabbos, Yishal la'anshe beise. A person should ask the people in his house, Belashon raka, gently. Why gently? So I saw in some places where they say that there's a special klippa that comes on Friday when there's a lot of pressure and stress in the house. I think we mentioned this already, and it tries to make a problem, anger, and people get fighting with each other. So therefore, that's why the halacha is saying make sure to ask gently, even though it's a busy day, and even though there's this extra sort of stress. But ask gently. Hifrashtem challah. When you bake the bread, did you remember to separate challah? And then they asked now to Rebbe, you should also ask if you gave meiser, and then you should also remind them to light the Shabbos candles at the right time. We'll come to Shabbos candles later. Sifchav Gimel, Chayav Adam the Mashmish Bevgada Be'erev Shabbos Kodim Chashecha. Every person should check through their clothing, their pockets, and things like that before Shabbos. Number one, to make sure that you don't have, then in those days they used to have it, nowadays not as much. Make sure you don't have any pins or things like that you're carrying that could be an issue. And also that there's nothing inside the pockets before you go out so you don't carry on Shabbos. Even if there's an Erev, you should still do this. Why? What would be the point of doing it if there's an Erev? You're allowed to carry. But he says, because maybe you have something that's muktzah, and today it's probably more applicable. People have coins, people have their phones, people have pens. So therefore, you should go through those pockets to make sure that you don't have any of that as well. And this is Siman Ayin Beis.